Jerry Shattuck of Lake City is the way I gotta call it. Boomer Winfrey, been around Lake City all his life. I don't know where Michael Foster went. I know he's the Lake City man in here. But we're fortunate to have Boomer with us today. I'm lucky got a hold of him this morning because I got a hold of him, tried to call him yesterday, and he thought it was next week. So we're glad to have him. Yes, ma'am.
It's not time for questioning.
I have a correction. You keep calling this place up there to north end of the county, Lake City.
I'm sorry, I'm old school.
I'm sorry.
That's what I call it. Cold Creek.
If anybody introduces me as being from Rocky Top, I'm going to catch you. I'm going to find out where you're drinking.
Boomer, glad to have you. Thanks. You're welcome, Boomer.
Almost didn't make it. I had a paper on my calendar. I had this down for next week. Fortunately, Ronnie caught me at a good time. Yeah, my name's Charles Winfrey, but everybody just calls nobody knows me by that. Everybody knows me as Boomer. I don't think Barry ever knew what my real name was.
Where'd you get that nickname?
I wasn't playing football. When I was in the 5th grade, my voice changed. Well, all the other little kids were getting little squeaky little boy voices. I'd say, Miss Ellenberg, can I go to the bathroom? You know, and they started kidding me about it because my voice got so deep so early in my life that they started calling me Boomer. And of course, I got mad. And when you get mad about a nickname, you're stuck with it for life. So it's been Boomer ever since. And, you know, I did for a number of years, I did some teaching on the side, after school teaching up in Campbell County for elementary kids, science enrichment. I just had them to call me Mr. Boomer, you know, so that's the only thing they ever knew me as. But anyway, in my recent reincarnation, I'm the historian, I guess the only unofficial historian that Cold Creek, Lake City, Rocky Top has. And, you know, I've been involved in the Cold Creek Miners Museum now ever since we started the thing back in the 1980s when we first established a little museum there during Lamar's Homecoming '86 celebration. And then it kind of cooled off and died away for a few years. Went into deep freeze at the community center while the town was still running it. And then a few years ago, we took interest in it again and revitalized it. The county was good enough to buy the old bank building there, the old Bank Oak Ridge building, give it to the city. And the city deeded it over to our nonprofit so we could get grants and things like that. And we finally opened up half of it. Still got half of it to go. The upstairs is finally got an elevator 2 years later than we expected to because the COVID delayed everything. We couldn't get the aluminum siding to build the elevator shaft for a year and a half. And we had to keep asking ARC to renew and extend this grant that we'd gotten to help build the elevator. And we finally got it done. Now it's all out of kilter and we can't get the contractor back to fix it. So we still haven't gotten upstairs opened up yet, but it's a work in progress. The reason we put that museum there, and the reason it's called the Cold Creek Miners Museum rather than Coal Mining Museum, is unlike some of these coal mining museums up in Kentucky and West Virginia that kind of glorified the coal industry, you know, and all that. We decided to focus on the miners and their families and the sacrifices they made. And when you tell that narrative, to a large degree, the companies are the bad guys. Certainly that was the case in the case of Cold Creek. Of course, some of y'all are old enough to remember when there was actually a rivalry between Lake City and Clinton, you know, in football and basketball and whatnot.
Yeah.
That rivalry dated all the way back to the turn of the century, when at one time, around 1900 or so, Lake City and Bryceville were the two largest towns in Anderson County. Lake City had 5,000 residents, Bryceville had 4,000, and Clinton was a sleepy little town with about 1,200 people, and Oak Ridge and Norris didn't exist. So you can see who elected all the politicians in the county is up on our end. Then as Clinton began to thrive and grow and Lake City began to decline, you know, all that changed a little bit, but the rivalries, you know, stayed there until, I guess, till Anderson County High School was opened up, and then things kind of changed a little bit. But the town of Lake City, or Cold Creek, let's just go back and call it Cold Creek, didn't exist before the Civil War. There was nothing there, just a few scattered farms. And they knew there was coal in those hills. Wasn't any way of getting it out. There were no railroads up through there, no rivers that you could put a barge on, and you couldn't haul coal out profitably by mule train. It just didn't work that way. So till after the Civil War, there was no way to mine any of the coal. But Knox Iron Company over in Knoxville started a foundry in Knoxville right after the war. And they decided we've got to have coal for this foundry. So they helped to finance a railroad from Knoxville out to Coal Creek, which just happened to be the closest place to Knoxville where you could get into the coal fields easily through the gap that the creek cut through Walden's Ridge. You know, you could actually get in there and run rail tracks into the mountains that way. So they built it out. 1868, nothing existed in Coal Creek. There was no listing of it anywhere. By 1869, Bradstreet business listings, which existed back then, had the town of Coal Creek listed of 12 businesses. Had a coal company, had a bank, a livery stable, a couple of a drugstore, and 6 saloons. Yeah, give you an idea how that town was started. It was started as like a Wild West boom town. A bunch of hard-working, hard-drinking miners. Nobody around here knew how to mine coal. These people were farmers and trappers and hunters and whatnot. They didn't know anything about mining coal. So Knox Iron had to go up to Pennsylvania and recruit a bunch of Welsh immigrants out of Pennsylvania coal fields and pay them bonuses and things to come down to Tennessee and mine their coal and teach the locals how to do it. They went up to New York and grabbed a few Welshmen who were coming off the boats straight out of Wales. So the first miners in the East Tennessee area were actually Welsh immigrants that came in. Y'all have ever been up to Briceville, notice that church on the hill, the white church? Everybody, it's a beautiful old building. It's got 2 steeples and 2 front doors. Why in the world they got 2 front doors, 2 steeples? It didn't start as a Methodist church, it started as a Welsh Anglican church. And their tradition was, men went in one side of the building and the women went in the other side. They stayed apart during the sermon to keep down any temptations. So they had to build 2 front doors to the church there. And as the Welsh immigrants began to assimilate and either go back to Wales or go back to Pennsylvania or, switch over to Southern Baptist or whatever, the church had to change hands and eventually became a Methodist church until they quit using it as a church a few years ago. The Briceville's now in the process of trying to raise money to refurbish and revitalize the old building. It's beginning to decay a little bit, but it's still a beautiful old building. We need to try and preserve it. Anyway, so the miners working at that Knox Iron Company mine, which was located real close to Coal Creek, just right through the gap and in the base of Owl Mountain, they went along fine. They ran a railroad track on up towards where Briceville's at now, and opened up a few more mines here and there. Other companies came in and started other mines. Then in 1876, you had a recession, and the demand for coal dropped off. And like a lot of people, when you have a recession, you make cuts. So the coal companies and the iron company all made cuts in their salaries and wages for the men. The miners there at Coal Creek Mining, at Knox Iron Company mine, didn't much care for the cuts, so they went on strike. And the company called up Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, which was this company that was located down in Grundy County, headquartered in Alabama, and said, we'd like to lease a few convicts from you to work in our mines. And that brings us back to the convict lease system, which was in effect in the South after the Civil War. After the Civil War was ended, all the old states of the old Confederacy were bankrupt. None of them had any money. But last thing they wanted to do is spend money incarcerating convicts, feeding them, clothing them, guarding them. They came up with this great idea. We'll lease the convicts out for private companies for labor and charge them a fee and make money off of them. And so that's what they all did. One by one, all the southern states, starting with Alabama, passed the convict lease systems, which allowed the state government to take all convicts that had at least a year in jail and lease them out for private work. In the Carolinas and Georgia, the textile mills got them. Mississippi, the planters ended up putting them in there picking cotton. In Tennessee and Alabama, one company got a lease for all the convicts, and they would sublease them out to other companies. They used them in coal mining and iron mining to a certain degree. So you had this system. But Alex Haley lived here in Anderson County. I once worked for a local newspaper, sort of a notorious one. There's an embarrassed bill in there, the Appalachian Observer. And I I was mostly a feature writer and wrote a lot of history articles, things like that. I got a chance to go out and interview Alex Haley for the paper. And he found out I knew a little bit about the Coal Creek War because I just done a series on it. So he ended up interviewing me more than I interviewed him. You know, you can see where he got his historical brilliance. But he enlightened me on some things I'd never realized. He said, you know, Jim Crow laws in the South, you know, people think of them as racist laws that separated the races. That was their effect. It wasn't their intent. Their intent was economic. You know, you're making money off convicts, you need more convicts to make more money. It's a self-perpetuating philosophy. You've got to have more people in prison so the state makes more money because they're not costing the state anything, they're actually making a profit of it. So let's change a whole lot of laws that had been misdemeanors, petty theft, 30 days in jail, to make them felonies. And put them in jail for a year, put them in prison for a year, then we can lease them out to the companies. He said a whole lot of the so-called Jim Crow laws were more about increasing the penalties for minor crimes. And then they added a few, you know, to separate the races where they could. And the target was squarely in the South was on the former population of slaves. Let's re-enslave the black people. He said that's what Jim Crow was all about, but it had an economic purpose. And he said, you know what 1129 is? I said, well, yeah, that's a jail sentence, 11 months, 29 days. Didn't exist before the Civil War. And then you talk to any judicial scholars, you'll find out it was created after the Civil War. And black people in the South called 1129 the white man's punishment. Have a white man, a black man before a judge for the same crime, let's say petty theft. You know, stealing the neighbor's fence posts and burn them in a hearth or something. They'd give the white man 11 months, 29 days and send him to the county jail. The black man get 1 year in prison and get sent off to the coal mines. So that was the origin of that sentence. And well, I'd never heard that, but it makes sense. I've never been able to find a lawyer yet that can confirm that's done enough research, but I have no reason to doubt Alex. He did a lot of research. So anyway, that was the situation when in 1876, the Coal Creek, the Knox Iron Company decided to bring convicts into Coal Creek. They brought in a load, they laid off all the miners, put the convicts to work in the mines, and nobody made much of a noise about it. You had all kinds of mines around there that were still working free miners. Most of those Welsh immigrants, the ones that got laid off and lost their jobs, a lot of them said, well, I'm going back to Pennsylvania where I'm appreciated. They went home. The few that had married into the area, you know, and decided they wanted to live in Tennessee, they could find jobs at other mines easy enough. So for 15 years, convicts were allowed to work in that one mine with no interruptions. And nobody paid much attention to it. You know, it was the only one in the area that worked convicts. All the other convict mines were way down in Grundy County, where TCINR had its main headquarters. So in 1891, something else happened. The little company up in Briceville, East Tennessee Mining Company, decided that it wanted to do some things differently. They had a check weighman. Miners were paid back in those days by how many tons they mined instead of how many hours they worked. Tennessee Ernie Ford, 16 tons, and what do you get? Another a day older and deeper in debt. I talked about the average number of tons a miner could produce in a day. And so a lot of coal miners took their sons into the mines with them to help them shovel the coal so they could produce more tonnage. I mean, 10 and 11-year-old boys in the mines with their daddies. The people up at the East Tennessee Mining Company in 1891, they suspected that the check weighman, the guy that the company hired to weigh their loads when they came to the top, might be putting his thumb under the scale and light weighing them, as opposed to the butcher who put his thumb on the scale. The check weighman was cheating the miners. So they went on strike and demanded to be allowed to elect one of their own men as a check weighman. The company wasn't about to do that, so they called TCNINR and said, we want to lease a few convicts from you. We got to teach some uppity miners up here a lesson. So they brought a group of convicts in, and this was a little bit different situation than what had happened 15 years earlier. These miners were working in the company And by then, most of the coal companies had built little company camps and company towns, and they had company houses, and they rented to the people. And a company doctor that everybody added a little money to the pot each month to pay the fee, and so on. They had a company, all of them had a company store. Most of them were paying the miners a script. And so the company told the convicts that, okay, your first job is go over there and evict those families out of those company houses. They don't belong there anymore. They've been laid off. Tear those houses down and use the timber to build your own stockade. Well, that was just a little bit too much. And, you know, these miners sit there. One thing to lose their jobs to a bunch of convicts, a bunch of darkies, but another thing to have those convicts sent into their homes to evict their families and put them out in the street and tear the houses down. So they all met in secret up at a church in Briceville, and about 200 of them marched up to the stockade one evening and demanded the guards surrender. There was only about half a dozen guards there. And they took the convicts and loaded them on a train, sent them to Knoxville with the guards with them, sent the governor a telegram and said, don't send any more convicts out here to Coal Creek, we're tired of it. And if you don't mind, let me sit down for a couple of minutes. I'm on oxygen at home, so I can only exert myself so much before I have to take a breather. So anyway, the governor was, ironically, he was a Farmers Alliance man. He was a big liberal for that time. But when he'd been in the legislature, he had actually, yeah, let's move that thing over.
Oh, thank you, man. I can see that.
When he had, when he was in the legislature, he voted to support the convict lease system when they voted for it. So he was big on it. And so he couldn't take that. He came out to Coal Creek personally on his Pullman car, went up to Briceville, pulled the car up into a switch over place. There was a big field and all the miners were gathered, made a big speech, lecturing them about obeying the law, and there's a right way and a wrong way to do everything, so on and so forth. And he left and brought the convicts back. And just to make sure there wasn't any problems, he brought a company of state militia from Knoxville over to guard the convicts and keep the miners at bay. So now instead of half a dozen guards, you had about 100 soldiers. They were all East Tennessee militia from Knox County and around. Their commander was actually the grandson of the first governor of the state, John Sevier. Granville Sevier was the colonel in charge. Well, okay, the miners and the convicts are back. Now they got 100 soldiers guarding them. What are we gonna do? Call for reinforcements. So they put out the word and said, we need help here in Coal Creek. We're taking a state on this convict thing. And the coal miners came in from all over the place. They came in from Jellicoe, Oliver Springs, Carrollville, places where mines had begun to grow up since Coal Creek first started to boom. They even came out of Kentucky. Kentucky, when they tried to pass the convict lease system back in the 1870s, the miners stopped it at the legislature. They didn't pass that law. And a lot of Tennessee coal miners went up there and helped their Kentucky brethren, lobby against it. So the Kentucky boys paid them back. They came down, got their guns, and came down to Coal Creek. So one evening, this was the first rebellion of the miners was on Bastille Day, right in the middle of July. The second one was a few weeks later, about a month or so later, in August. The miners walked up, a group of them walked up to the stockade gates, asked the colonel to come out and negotiate with them. He walked out there, and okay, what do y'all want? We want you to take those convicts, go back to Nashville with them. We can't do that, I've got orders. I said, well, we've got a little something to talk to you about on that. And one of the miners' spokespeople dropped a handkerchief or something to signal, and 2,000 miners popped up from behind the trees and rocks and everything with all their guns, click, click, click. The colonel looked around and said, I'll negotiate. And so the soldiers surrendered without firing a shot. And this time the miners marched put the convicts back on the train again, marched the soldiers down to the depot and gave them their guns back so they could guard those dangerous convicts and send them back to Knoxville. Well, the governor was perplexed. He didn't know what to do. He ended up getting his commissioner of labor, John Ford, to come out to Cold Creek and negotiate with the miners and say, well, we can't bluff them down, we'll try to talk them down. And what Ford said, he says, we don't have any place to put these convicts, we don't have any state prisons. You gotta help us out here, work with us. We'll call a special session of the legislature and we'll address your grievances if you'll just, give us a little time, let us put the convicts back in the stockade where they were. Because the miners had not only freed the ones up in Briceville, they'd also freed the 150 or so at the Knox Iron Company stockade. And so the miners, being trusting souls, they said, you're gonna call a special session of the legislature to address our grievances? Okay, we'll let you bring the convicts back out, No guards, no soldiers. We'll give our word not to disturb them. You can bring some prison guards, but don't bring any more Army boys out here. So everything settled down, and the governor, true to his word, he called a special session in late in the year, and right around Halloween time, and the legislature met. And that legislature back then wasn't a whole lot more efficient than some of the ones we've had in recent years. They sat there and they argued and debated for a week or so, and in the end they went home and passed one new law to make it a felony to interfere with the convict lease system. So the miners, they realized they'd been betrayed. The group that had gone down to lobby the legislature, they came back and they said, we tender our resignations as your negotiating committee. Looks like you just need to put your trust in the Lord, because you're not going to get any help here on earth. Well, that was like a declaration of war. So what happened is the miners marched back to the stockade again. And this time, they didn't march those convicts down the tracks and send them to Nashville or send them to Knoxville. They broke into the company stores and, brought the convicts in and said, there's you some civilian clothes, change out those stripes and put on civilian clothes, and Kentucky's that way, boys, get. And so they freed all the convicts and sent them packing in every which direction. I first got interested in the Cold Creek War, the history. It was because my grandmother was a hell of a storyteller, and she was a sharp. And she told me about her daddy had been one of the miners. And she told me about how, well, when they broke into the company store, said one of those convicts found some boots that would fit him but didn't have no laces in them. My daddy took the laces out of his own boots and gave them to the convict, and he laced them up, and then he said, okay, now get going to Kentucky. And I was thrilled by that, just visualizing that whole thing. It encouraged me to do more research on the Cold Creek War. But anyway, so the convicts all were released. They didn't close the stockades down, they burned them to the ground. So it was like a declaration of war. Governor, you want to play hardball? We can play hardball. Nothing happened for a couple of months. Then on January 1st, New Year's Day, train pulled into the side in the Cold Creek, and a group of convicts moved off the train, guarded by militia. And this time there was about 3 times as many militias as there was the first time. And they went up on a hill above the stockade and built a fort called Fort Anderson, after the commander that was in charge of Keller Anderson. And it overlooked the area where the stockade was at, and they had Gatling guns and artillery and everything else, and 3 companies of militia, about 300 men. And said, okay, let's see if those miners are willing to take on some Gatling guns. And for months after that, nothing happened. Cold Creek was kind of in a state of martial law. The soldiers would, come down to town. When they were off duty, they'd come down and drink, they'd get in fist fights and the usual things. And the miners didn't do anything. They just sat back and, what can we do? Only that one mine brought convicts back, because the one up in Briceville that had started the whole mess in the first place, they went bankrupt. They told the governor, said, no, don't send any more convicts to us, we don't want them. So only the Knox Iron Company mine had convicts in it. And
now, was that the Freighterville mine or the Beach Road mine?
Neither one. Knox Iron Company mine is at the base of Val Mountain.
Okay.
It is where Lake City for years and years got its water supply out of an old coal mine at the base of the mountain. That was the old Knox Iron Company mine. It's completely sealed off. And although, you think of water coming out of a coal mine as being this acid mine drainage, that's only if it's exposed to open oxygen as a catalyst. Well, that iron concentration in that water turn it acidic. If it's sealed, it's good water. It's heavy in iron. It'll rust your pipes and stain your sink after a while with orange, but it's healthy water to drink. So for years and years, Lake City got its water supply. They sealed off the mouth that mine with a little water purification plant, and pumped the water out of that sealed off mine for years and years. It's just right at the base of about where the Y is at, where the road splits to go to Beach Grove and Bryceville. And all the other mines were on up the road towards Fraterville and Bryceville and on up. But anyway, that mine was there at the base of the hill, and there was a little knoll above it that we call Militia Hill, where they built the fort, looking down on. And they clear cut all the trees, so they had a line of fire, and you couldn't do anything about the soldiers seeing it. And for months, nothing happened. A couple people finally lost their lives. The first people that nobody had been killed. The first two uprisings had all been bloodless. You know, the guards and the soldiers surrendered without a fight. But and the third time around, I think the guards got roughed up a little bit. And the stockades were burned, but nobody was killed there either. Ironically, the first people to die, first one that's on record as dying was a convict. Back in those days when you had something going on that was newsworthy, photographers always seemed to find their way to the site, take photographs, and then go back to their studios and make postcards out of them and come back and sell them to the people that were involved. You know, they did that at the Fraterville mine. That's all these pictures you see of the Fraterville mine disaster were taken by a guy that wanted to make postcards out of them and sell them to the families and the news people and whatnot. Well, same thing at the Cold Creek War. So there's a photographer up there on the mountain, got a bunch of soldiers to pose with a convict holding him, rifles on him, and him with his hand up, and one of the rifles discharged and killed the poor guy. The convict was accidentally killed. He was the first recorded death in the whole Cold Creek War, was an accidental death by somebody posing for a photograph. Don't tell me the news can't be deadly. You know, but anyway, and you know, another death that happened during that period of time was Dick Drummond, who some of y'all may be somewhat familiar. That I'm running out of time on it. 30 minutes is not good for me. I think it's good hours. Give me 5 more minutes and I'll make it quick.
Okay.
Dick Drummond was a young miner that got in a fist fight with a bunch of soldiers at a dance in Bryceville. And when he left the dance later on, the soldiers jumped him and hanged him, lynched him. And they made songs about it, and even did a play about Dick Drummond. The bridge where they lynched him is still there. It's Drummond's Trestle. At the time, it was an old covered railroad bridge, but now it's just a trestle over the creek. But there was nothing went on until the next year, rolled around July again. And the miners down in Grundy County had been hearing all about what was going on up in Cold Creek, but they hadn't done anything. They'd been under the yoke of the convict police system longer than anybody. So they decided, well, that's time for us to free our convicts. So they broke into the stockade, freed all the convicts, burned the stockade to the ground. When they heard about it up in Cold Creek, they said, let's see if the governor can fight a war on 2 fronts at the same time. So they all the miners got their guns, and they went up and they rushed the fort. And they didn't get them very far. The Gatling guns cut down several of them, and they had to back off. I said, well, you know, we can't take that fort by storm, but they built that to guard the stockade. They didn't think about the fact that Walden's Ridge and Val Mountain are higher than the fort. We can get up there on the trees and the rocks, shoot down on them, and starve those boys out. So that's what the miners did. They put the fort under siege for 2 weeks. The governor did his best to try to do something about it. He called out all the sheriffs and then to East Tennessee, said, please, you know, organize posses and go to the rescue of those poor soldiers. The Anderson County sheriff had urgent business down in Chattanooga, and he was out of town that week. The fact that all of his votes came from up there might have something to do with it. Later on, he successfully made it to became the Anderson County county judge for a number of years. So I guess politically it worked for him. A group of volunteers over in Knoxville was raised by an old ex-sheriff over there. About 200 of them marched out to Cold Creek. They were going to come to the rescue of that fort. They got as far as Offits, halfway between here and Lake City, and the tracks were blocked, so they had to get off. they found a local justice of the peace, and at gunpoint they said, take us and show us this trail we've heard about that goes over the back of Walden's Ridge into Bryceville the back way. So he led them around in circles for 2 or 3 hours and wouldn't take them anywhere until they finally realized what he was doing and threatened to kill him. He finally showed them the trail up to the top of the ridge, and they all got up there. It was getting close to dark by the time the posse got to the top of the ridge. All of a sudden, halt, who goes there? And a shot rang out, and they returned fire. You know, the posse was going up the ridge in 2 columns, and the right-hand column turned left, and the left-hand column turned right, and they shot each other to pieces. There were about a half a dozen of them were killed. It was the most loss, grievous loss of life in the whole thing so far. Was friendly fire. They dragged the bodies off the ridge, and they retreated back to the railroad, came back to Knoxville, said, we got turned away at the top of Walden's Ridge by an army of miners. We had to come back. And, you know, the newspaper made a big deal out of it. Later on, the Knoxville Journal discovered and wrote up, well, the army of miners turned out to be 2 teenage boys with squirrel rifles that had been assigned to watch that back trail. And when they saw those people coming up the ridge, they fired 1 shot and skedaddled off the other side of the ridge. And so, you know, they made heroes out of a whole bunch of fools, more or less. But a lot of the Cold Creek War is like that. It's devastating humor in a way, dark humor in a way when you think about it. And you know, the siege went on for a couple of weeks. I can talk to you more and more about it. I've run out. I've already run out now. But the end was that the governor raised every company of militia he could from middle and west Tennessee. He didn't trust East Tennessee militia. He thought they were too threatened with the miners, and they surrendered too quickly a year before, so he didn't call them out. He just got the west and middle Tennessee militia and brought them in. When they'd mustered in about 2,000 men over at the UT campus where they used the mustering ground, they loaded them up with artillery and came out to Cold Creek, surrounded the town with artillery, and sent the miners a message, said, we're going to blow the town to smithereens, your family's with it if you don't lay down your guns and surrender. So the miners surrendered. They lost the battle. They couldn't outgun the militia in the end. There was too much at stake. The militia proceeded to go around and disarm every miner they found. The General Carnes' orders to his men was arrest everybody between 8 and 80 until their innocence could be proved. So, you know, instead of being innocent until proven guilty, it was guilty until proven innocent if you're a male that live in Cold Creek. So they rounded them up, and they locked them up in the churches. They locked them up in the farmer's supply house. When they ran out of room there, they brought in a bunch of boxcars on the railroad side and locked them up in the boxcars. You know, in the August heat, that was really good. You know, I'm sure those miners loved that. In the end, they got everybody disarmed. They let them all go. And for the next year or so, they had to keep the army out there in Cold Creek and camp there along the railroad tracks to make sure the miners didn't rise up again. You know, now the miners had lost the battle. But come the next legislative session, the bean counters got busy down there in Nashville and said, hey, here's how much money we made leasing convicts last year. Here's how much money we spent keeping an army of 2,000 men in the field, fed, you know, and uniformed and paying their wages. We need to do something different. So the Tennessee became the first state in the South to outlaw convict leasing. And it was like dominoes. When the word got around that Tennessee, what the miners in Tennessee had done, the textile workers in Georgia and South Carolina said, maybe it's time we had a little bit of the textile mills. So those states began to, you know, withdraw the convict lease they had. Mississippi, the sharecroppers down in Mississippi that lost their contracts and their lands to convicts, you know, no longer had the jobs. They said, well, we can burn a few cotton fields too. They burn as good as grass does. And so one by one, all the southern states outlawed convict leasing until Alabama was the last one. They held out to 1913. They finally gave up. And so, you know, one very dismal, dark chapter in American history was ended, and it began there in Cold Creek here in Anderson County. And you know, that's that's one small fraction of the story we tell at the museum. You know, when you go on to talk about the mine disasters, and I could spend another hour telling you about Freighterville and how that went on, but I'm out of time. I will say this, you know, people ask me there at the museum every once in a while I'm in there, well, what's the deal with coal? What's the future? Is there any future in coal now? Nobody's mining it anymore. I said, well, in 1890s, it took 350 men with picks and shovels and, you know, hand drills to mine 1 million tons of coal a year. But in the 1940s, about 100 men with continuous miners and automated equipment could mine that same 1 million tons underground, so 2/3 of those miners had lost their jobs. But in the 1970s, a half a dozen guys with D9 dozers and front end loaders could mine that same 1 million tons of coal in a strip mine, and all those other miners have lost their jobs. You know, is there a future? Well, Tennessee only has 1 coal mine in the whole state operating right now. We've got a dozen or so with permits, including the old Freeman Coal Company mine up in Briceville, and several still got active permits. They ain't got no contracts to sell their coal. Nobody wants their coal anymore because there's no demand for it. You know, the Clean Air Act and, you know, the fact that people in cities are tired of breathing that hunky stuff has put an end to it. So is there a future for coal? Yeah. They go from the 6 men with D9 dozers to 25 years from now, be 2 guys in lab coats in a room somewhere pushing buttons. And when they do, they'll gasify the coal underground and it'll turn into gas, they'll pipe it to the surface, and you'll never see the coal. It'll stay underground. And if there is a future for coal, that's what it is. It's high tech, no employment. You know, so right now, you know, I'd say the coal mining as we know it is a thing of the past. And you know, what we do there at the Coal Creek Miners Museum is we try to celebrate, you know, recognize that, you know, coal's a thing of the past and it had its good and it had its bad. It helped fuel the Industrial Revolution. If it hadn't been for the coal to fuel the trains and the steamships of the 1800s, and later on the steam plants of TVA, they helped electrify the valley, where would we be today? So coal played its role. It's a role that's in the past now. Anybody tells you differently is a damn fool, but you know, it played an important part. And one of the things that we want to make sure there in Lake City is that the sacrifice of all those miners that died in coal mine disasters, and they're still dying today of black lung, and you know, the sacrifices they made and their families made in living in mostly in poverty in these coal camps are not forgotten, they're honored. And so that's what we're trying to do at the museum. With that, I'll shut my mouth.